He was born from a union of cousins, married his own cousin, and lost his only child. In just 2 years, he lost his crown. The last king of the Two Sicilies, Francis II, died alone, exiled, childless, forgotten. Not defeated by war, but by his blood. He was born into a palace built on secrets and on cousins. Francis II of the Two Sicilies took his first breath on January 16, 1836, in Naples, wrapped not in linen alone, but in 1,000 years of royal bloodlines turning back in on themselves. His cradle stood in halls lined with silk, incense, and expectation. But beneath the marble, the walls were cracked. Not visibly, not loudly, but undeniably. This was a kingdom built by marriages that prioritized blood over distance, names over nature, duty over life. His father, King Ferdinand II, was the embodiment of old power. Stern, superstitious, ruthlessly Catholic, his mother, Maria Theresa of Austria, was not just a Habsburg, she was her husband's first cousin. The union had been orchestrated to preserve dynastic purity, to solidify the link between the Bourbon rulers of Naples and the waning prestige of Vienna. But no one asked how much a body could bear when the same blood loops again and again. No one wondered what happens when a family tree becomes a circle. Francis was quiet from the start. Not weak, not yet, but quiet in a way that worried nurses and comforted priests. He did not cry often. He stared too long. He obeyed without question. There was something glassy about his manner, even in childhood, as if he were being raised not to live, but to endure. He had his father's eyes, large and dark, always a little sunken, but little else. While Ferdinand was called Re Bomba for his readiness to use force, for his cannons and cruelty, Francis would be remembered as Francis the Good, a nickname that sounded like a blessing, but landed more like a sigh. A way to name a king who never quite ruled. A boy who aged into power, but never grew into it. The court was ceremonial and severe. Religion bled into every corner of royal life. Francis's days were structured by bells, morning prayers, Latin lessons, daily mass, catechism, inspections, repetition. His mother, devout and distant, encouraged piety over play. His father, though often away quelling revolts or reinforcing censorship, demanded obedience and presence, but rarely affection. Francis grew up learning to fold his hands before he learned to raise them. His world was one of portraits, relics, echoing chapels, and the slow accumulation of ritual. He was not allowed to run, not allowed to fall, not allowed to forget that he was the heir of a crown more fragile than gold. His tutors spoke of duty, of order, of France, of Austria, of the papacy, but they did not speak of happiness. That word had no weight inside the Palazzo Reale. What mattered was appearance, piety, and the preservation of things as they had always been. In such an environment, Francis learned early to keep his thoughts to himself, to suppress desire, to fear error as if it were sin. Physically, he was delicate, thin-boned, narrow-chested, his spine slightly curved in a way that tailors learn to compensate for in royal portraits. He moved with the hesitancy of someone aware of his own awkwardness. Some doctors whispered of inherited degeneration, but no one would dare suggest that the king's heir had been touched by the consequences of consanguinity. Instead, they praised his quiet demeanor as modesty, his paleness as purity, his solemn gaze as wisdom. But behind palace walls, servants saw more. They noticed the tremble in his fingers, the stiffness in his joints. They whispered about the nights he cried behind heavy drapes, or the days he refused food. They noticed that he read too many saints' biographies and too few state documents, that he asked questions about the soul, but rarely about the army. They noticed he was lonely. Francis had no brothers, no sisters, no playmates other than statues and portraits of long-dead royals. His childhood was conducted under painted ceilings, surrounded by courtiers who bowed but never listened. He was never shouted at, never struck, never ridiculed. But he was never loved loudly either. Affection in the Neapolitan court came in the form of correction, of tightening collars and reciting scripture. He was raised to be righteous. He was not raised to be strong. As a teenager, he began to attend councils of state, though he rarely spoke. His father expected him to learn by watching executions, watching arrests, watching bureaucrats turn unrest into reports. He attended processions in full uniform, but often appeared distracted, his gaze drifting above the crowds. He preferred chapels to armories, preferred silence to strategy. He was, in every way, the son of a dynasty that had forgotten how to survive. The Two Sicilies, a kingdom covering the southern half of the Italian peninsula and the island of Sicily, was one of the last strongholds of Bourbon absolutism in Europe. While revolutions swept through France, while nationalists stirred in the north, while liberalism rippled across the continent, Naples remained rigid, cloistered, defensive. And Francis, raised in the shadows of that stubborn regime, absorbed its fears, but none of its fire. At 17, he was confirmed as heir. The people cheered, though quietly. His portrait was hung beside his father's in municipal buildings. Coins were minted with his profile. But even then, rumors swirled that he was too soft, that he was too holy, that he had his mother's nerves and his grandfather's bones, that he had been born not to lead, but to apologize. And still, he carried the hopes of a kingdom. The court knew the dangers of bloodlines that spiraled inward, but they refused to speak of them. The physicians knew the risks of hereditary fragility, but they muted their reports. The church offered prayers. The aristocracy offered alliances. But no one offered Francis the thing he needed most, the chance to be anything other than a symbol of a system already dying. He was shaped not into a man, but into a relic. By the time he turned 20, his eyes already looked old, not wise, not hardened, but tired, as if he had inherited more than titles, more than tapestries, more than treaties, as if he had inherited exhaustion itself. And in that quiet exhaustion, a kingdom waited to collapse. Before Francis could learn to lead, he had already learned to yield. His father, King Ferdinand II of the Two Sicilies, was a monarch made of stone, loud in decree, swift in punishment, and utterly immovable. He ruled not by inspiring affection, but by instilling obedience. Known across Europe as Re Bomba, the Bomb King, he earned the name not from metaphor, but from action. When the Sicilian Revolution of 1848 erupted, Ferdinand responded with cannon fire. The city of Messina was shelled into surrender. Naples applauded. Foreign observers recoiled. Ferdinand did not govern. He dominated. His justice was brutal, his politics reactionary, and his love conditional. His ministers were terrified of him. His subjects obeyed him. And his son, his only male heir, feared him more than anyone else in the kingdom. Francis, in his father's court, was not shaped. He was contained. From early childhood, Ferdinand kept his son at a distance, physically present, emotionally exiled. He insisted on protocol, on hierarchy, on silence. Francis was allowed to watch, but not speak, allowed to study, but not question. He could sit at the edge of meetings, but not contribute. His education was thorough, yet narrow. History was taught as reverence, not as inquiry. Political philosophy was skipped entirely. The only constant was doctrine, religious, royal, and absolute. He never learned how to challenge power, only how to absorb it. Ferdinand, for all his might, saw his son not as a partner in kingship, but as an extension of his own legacy, to be molded with discipline, fear, and holy instruction. Affection was withheld, sometimes cruelly. Francis was publicly corrected when he slouched, when he spoke too softly, when he failed to salute fast enough. In private, he was ignored. He dined separately. He prayed alone. He received more attention from confessors than from his own father. Ferdinand considered emotion a defect, vulnerability a disease. He believed that kings must appear invincible, even to their children, especially to their children. So Francis grew beneath a shadow that was not just long, but suffocating. The difference between them was evident in everything. Where Ferdinand had a booming voice, Francis barely spoke above a whisper. Where Ferdinand barked orders, Francis bowed and deferred. Where the father crushed rebellions without blinking, the son flinched at raised voices. Ferdinand relished confrontation. Francis recoiled from it. Even their bodies contradicted one another. The father broad and thick-chested, the son narrow-shouldered, slightly hunched, eyes always a little downcast. The court noticed. Ministers compared them in whispers. Servants shook their heads quietly. Diplomats wrote letters home describing a prince too tender for the throne. And Ferdinand? He said nothing. But his silence was louder than insult. There were moments, rare and brief, when the old king seemed to notice his son, when he nodded after a well-memorized speech or offered a faint smile during Mass. Francis cherished those moments like sunlight through stained glass. But they never lasted. Ferdinand did not nurture. He expected. He expected strength, authority, ferocity. And Francis, no matter how hard he tried, could only offer loyalty. The prince would sit for hours outside his father's chambers, waiting for an audience. Sometimes he was granted 5 minutes, sometimes none. He kept a journal, mostly prayers and quotations from scripture, with occasional confessions of longing. May I someday be worthy of him. God grant me the strength to serve as he does. To be a good son, even if unseen. But unseen he remained. His father's reign was one of resistance against modernity. While the rest of Italy moved toward unification, Ferdinand held tight to absolutism, to censorship, to reactionary law. The very idea of a constitution was blasphemy to him. His prisons were full, his spies were everywhere, and his kingdom, though momentarily stable, was a pressure cooker of unrest. Francis watched it all with a kind of passive fear. He did not share his father's appetite for violence, but neither did he question it. He watched people disappear, protests be crushed, pamphlets be burned. He listened, he nodded, he prayed. But he never interfered. Perhaps he believed it was not his place. Perhaps he believed it was too late to change course. Or perhaps more deeply, he had already resigned himself to an inheritance he did not choose and could never reshape. He loved Naples, but he did not understand how to defend it. When Ferdinand's health began to fail in the late 1850s, the court became uneasy. Rumors swirled of plots, of nationalist agents infiltrating Sicily, of Garibaldi's name whispered in the south. But the king, stubborn to the end, dismissed them all. He trusted iron more than insight. He believed God would preserve the throne, as he always had. Francis began to attend more functions in his father's place, standing stiffly in military uniform, reciting carefully prepared speeches. He shook hands with generals. He nodded at bishops. But his presence was ceremonial. Everyone knew who still ruled. Then, in May 1859, Ferdinand II died. The bomb king was gone, and his quiet, uncertain son became king. Francis was 23 years old. He stood beside his father's coffin, pale and unmoving, the weight of centuries pressing into his spine. The people came to see their new monarch, some out of hope, many out of habit, most out of obligation. The crown was placed on his head in silence. He swore the oaths. He made the sign of the cross. And as cannons fired into the bay in ceremonial salute, his hands trembled at his sides. No one could say whether he was mourning his father or fearing the future. He did not command applause. He did not inspire devotion. He simply inherited a kingdom teetering on the brink, a court divided by ambition, a south boiling with revolution, and a shadow, tall, stern, and absent, that would follow him for the rest of his reign. He had spent his life beneath that shadow, and now he would be judged by how he failed to escape it. He married her because he was told to. She married him because she had no choice. Their wedding was a triumph of lineage and protocol, and a quiet funeral for hope. Maria Sophie of Bavaria arrived in Naples as a bride, but she had been groomed from childhood to become a symbol. She was radiant, sharp-minded, full of youth, raised in the liberal court of the Wittelsbachs, with thoughts of poetry and horseback riding still in her head. The sea air of Naples struck her as heavy, the palace cloistered, the courtiers rigid, and her husband, pale, prayerful, watchful, was a man she could not yet decipher. Francis met her with courtesy, not affection. He bowed too deeply. He averted his eyes. His hands, gloved in ceremonial white, shook slightly when he touched hers. There were smiles exchanged, but not laughter. Promises made, but not warmth. They were cousins, by blood, by title, by dynastic necessity, and now they were bound together not by love, but by strategy. The marriage was political, papal, and irrevocable. The ceremony, held in 1859, was lavish in design and hollow in intimacy. Bishops presided, nobles attended, musicians played, cannons fired. The kingdom, already trembling beneath the surface from unrest, was instructed to celebrate. But Maria Sophie, behind her veil, wept silently on the night before the vows. Not from fear, not from anger, but from a deep, unspoken mourning, the quiet death of her own will. The wedding night was worse. There are different versions of what happened or did not happen. Some said the king was impotent, unable or unwilling to consummate the union. Others whispered of a hidden deformity, of a trauma buried so deep that no affection could thaw it. One report, later circulated in Vienna and denied in Naples, claimed that Francis was so modest, so devout, that he refused to undress before his wife. Another claimed he fell to his knees and began to pray instead of touching her. The truth is still debated. But what remains clear is this: there was no child that night, nor for many nights after. And in a palace where the queen's belly was watched more closely than her eyes, this absence was dangerous. Maria Sophie, at first, tried to reach him. She sat with him during Mass, took walks with him in the gardens, attempted soft conversation during meals. She wrote him letters from her own chambers, sweet, reserved, full of carefully chosen words, but received only short replies. She asked about his childhood. He answered with doctrine. She asked about their future. He turned to Scripture. He was not cruel. He was never harsh. But he was not there. Not truly. He had learned from his father that kings must rule alone. He had learned from his mother that women belong in silence. And he had learned from his own body that closeness was dangerous. Emotionally, physically, genealogically. So he shut the door. And the court, hungry for scandal, opened its mouth. Gossip spread like rot beneath velvet. They said the king had no desire. They said he was not a man. They said he feared the female body as if it were fire. They mocked the queen behind closed doors, called her a virgin wife. A northern flower wilted in southern stone. Servants repeated rumors in the kitchens. Ambassadors reported them to foreign capitals. France whispered. Austria winced. The Vatican prayed for discretion. But Maria Sophie endured. She smiled at public events. She attended banquets. She kissed orphans and blessed coins. But in her private chambers, she wrote in her diary of loneliness, so sharp it burned through her pen. She was 18, vibrant, born into a century already changing, and trapped in a kingdom where her only duty was to be a womb with a crown. And that womb remained empty. Until, miraculously, it did not. In 1861, Maria Sophie became pregnant. The court erupted in relief. The king gave thanks. The Vatican rejoiced. The people hoped. For a brief moment, the whispers died down. The queen was seen walking slowly in the gardens, her hands resting softly on her growing belly. The king visited her more often. He even smiled once in public. They began to speak, if not of love, then of purpose. But hope is brittle in the halls of inbred dynasties. The child, a daughter, was born early. Too early. Francesca Maria Pia, their only child, breathed for a few months. Just long enough to be named. Just long enough to be baptized. Just long enough for the queen to hold her, to sing to her, to imagine a future where something survived them. And then, she died. There was no great funeral, no national mourning, no statues, only a tiny coffin, only a devastated mother, and a father who disappeared again into prayer. Francis did not scream, he did not break. He simply returned to his chapel and knelt for hours without moving. Maria Sophie, however, cracked. She stopped speaking to her husband. She stopped attending court. Her letters to her family grew darker. She once wrote, "I am living among shadows. They expect me to produce life in a place that does not know how to live." Their marriage, already strained, became a shell. They lived under the same roof, but in separate worlds. The child they had lost became the only thing they had truly shared. And even that became too painful to name. The people noticed. The court speculated. The ministers braced, because when a royal couple cannot produce an heir, a kingdom begins to panic. And outside the palace walls, Garibaldi's red shirts were already marching. The war did not begin with cannon fire. It began with rumors and hesitation. In early 1860, the kingdom of the Two Sicilies stood on the edge of an earthquake it refused to see. While Europe modernized and northern Italy unified under Piedmontese banners, Naples remained frozen, ornate, devout, unchanged. Francis II, newly crowned and still reeling from the death of his only daughter, believed that loyalty could be preserved through prayer, that rebellion could be softened by patience. That time, somehow, would be merciful. But time does not wait for kings who cannot act. The red shirts landed in Sicily in May. A ragtag army led by Giuseppe Garibaldi. Their cause was neither divine nor dynastic. They marched not for a throne, but for unification, for Italy, for a country that did not yet exist, but already pulsed through the dreams of thousands. Farmers, students, exiles, soldiers. They rallied with fervor. They advanced with speed. And within days, they were winning. Francis, in his palace in Naples, was informed of the landing. He read the dispatches. He consulted his ministers. He fasted. He prayed. But he did not move. He believed, or perhaps needed to believe, that Sicily would hold, that the military garrisons, still loyal in theory, would crush the incursion, that the people, grateful for his father's order and his own gentleness, would rally to the crown. But they didn't. They surrendered. They switched sides. They cheered the rebels. The king hesitated. He could have launched a counteroffensive. He could have called for reinforcements from Austria, pleaded for aid from the Pope, mobilized the fleet. But each decision came too late, each order too softened by caution. His generals waited, his ministers panicked, and while they whispered and drafted and redrafted commands, Garibaldi moved. By August, Sicily was his. The court grew tense. Nobles sent their families north. Foreign diplomats began to withdraw. The Queen, Maria Sophie, demanded action, but found herself silenced in meetings where no women were allowed, no voices raised. She wrote to her sister in Bavaria, "They are waiting to be devoured." And still, Francis waited. He issued a constitution, a reform. Too little, too late. The people, starved of change and full of rage, ignored it. Protesters filled the streets of Palermo and Naples, not with royalist hymns, but with nationalist songs. The tricolor flag appeared. Statues of Bourbon kings were defaced. In September, Garibaldi crossed into the mainland. It was no longer a rebellion, it was a collapse. Francis ordered his army to resist. But what army? What loyalty? Regiments disbanded overnight. Officers defected. Some even joined the red shirts. Others simply walked away. When Garibaldi approached Naples, the king's most trusted advisors begged him to flee, to regroup in the fortress city of Gaeta. Francis resisted the idea. A king does not run. A king does not abandon his people. But Maria Sophie, sharp as ever, told him plainly, "If you stay, you will be captured. If you leave, you may still be king tomorrow." He fled. On the morning of September 6, 1860, Francis II and Maria Sophie left Naples by carriage, disguised as common travelers. They left behind their palace, their court, their city. No crowds lined the streets. No soldiers saluted. The people of Naples watched in silence, some with sympathy, many with contempt, as the last Bourbon king disappeared down the road like a man going into exile. The next day, Garibaldi entered the city. He was met with cheers. Bells rang. Flowers were thrown. The people did not miss their monarch. The House of Bourbon had ruled Naples and Sicily for over 700 years. It ended in a single week. But Francis was not yet finished. He reached Gaeta, a coastal fortress surrounded by high stone walls and cannons facing the sea, and made his stand. It was not political strategy. It was stubbornness or desperation, or perhaps faith, the kind that cannot admit defeat, even as the gates begin to crack. There, in Gaeta, the last echo of the kingdom gathered. Loyal officers, surviving troops, clergymen, remnants of a collapsing aristocracy. And Maria Sophie, refusing to retreat to safety, stayed by her husband's side. She wore military-style clothing. She stood on the ramparts. She helped distribute food. In the cold wind and smoke, she became a symbol, not of failure, but of defiance. Gaeta was surrounded. The Piedmontese army shelled it without rest. Artillery thundered night after night. Buildings collapsed. Supplies ran low. Water became scarce. Disease spread. Bread turned to dust. Men died with no glory, only shrapnel and silence. The royal couple slept in damp quarters beneath crumbling ceilings. Maria Sophie reportedly subsisted on broth and bitter wine, her hands blistered from carrying ammunition. Francis knelt daily in the chapel, lips moving without sound. They held out for 3 months. In the end, nothing remained. On February 13th, 1861, after 102 days of siege, Francis surrendered. He did not cry. He did not speak. He simply signed the documents, handed over the last banner of his kingdom, and stepped back into a life without a crown. The war had come, and the king had done nothing but watch it arrive. There was no final battle. No heroic last charge. No torn flag waving from the heights. Just a door left open. And a silence that swallowed centuries. Naples did not fall like a fortress. It folded like paper. With hardly a whisper, the capital of the Two Sicilies, once a jewel of Bourbon rule, once a kingdom unto itself, surrendered not with gunfire, but with applause. On September 7th, 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi entered the city through streets that had already erased their monarch. People clapped, windows opened, crowds formed, flowers were thrown from balconies, bells rang from churches that once prayed for kings. No one cried out for Francis. No one waited for his return. The throne had vanished overnight, and almost no one looked for it. The royal standard was taken down, the tricolor of Italy raised. The Bourbon seals were removed from buildings, scraped from fountains, pulled from coins. In the same piazzas where royal proclamations had once echoed, now echoed the voices of patriots, students, merchants, people who had grown tired of prayers and taxes and the smell of ancient power. In the cafes and the markets, people spoke of unification, of Cavour and Garibaldi in Piedmont. The king's name was no longer spoken in reverence. It was not even spoken in hatred. It was simply forgotten. 700 years of monarchy, dismissed in a single breath. In the royal palace, the rooms remained intact. The curtains still swayed, the portraits still hung. But the king was gone, and so they meant nothing. Ministers once loyal to the Bourbon court pledged allegiance to the new order without ceremony. Some did so for survival, some for ideology, most because they knew the tide had already turned, and no man, no matter how pious or polite, could swim against it alone. What Francis could not defend, history did not wait to bury. From Gaeta, he watched the reports come in, scribbled letters from loyalists, formal notices from foreign observers, even desperate appeals from priests who still believed in divine monarchy. But the city had moved on. Naples was no longer his. It was no longer a capital. It was now a province in a new kingdom, one that had no place for fragile kings. Maria Sophie took the news more bitterly. She paced the walls of Gaeta with clenched fists. She cursed the generals who had abandoned them, the ministers who had fled, the people who had cheered the enemy. She wrote to her sister with venom. They have spat on their history. They have traded a crown for a slogan. Her fury, unlike her husband's grief, burned hot. But it changed nothing. After the fall of Gaeta, they moved briefly to the fortress of Civitella del Tronto, another stronghold, another holdout, another delay of the inevitable. But by March 1861, Italy had spoken. The kingdom of the Two Sicilies was no more. Victor Emmanuel II of Piedmont was proclaimed King of Italy. A nation had been born, and Francis II, once sovereign of the largest kingdom in the peninsula, became a footnote. There was no trial, no execution, no exile declared by decree. The new Italy, in its triumph, chose erasure over spectacle. And that, perhaps, was the cruelest cut. Francis and Maria Sophie left Italian soil under escort, not as prisoners, not as criminals, but as relics. They boarded a ship in silence. No crowds watched them depart. The dock workers turned their backs. The flags waved for someone else now. From the deck, Francis looked back toward Naples. He saw only rooftops, smoke, distant towers. He did not cry. He did not speak. He closed his eyes and bowed his head. And in that moment, the distance between king and subject became permanent. In exile, they were offered shelter in Rome by Pope Pius X, a fellow monarch losing ground to the new order. For a time, Francis found solace in the papal court, its rituals, its incense, its old rhythms. But it was not Naples. It was not sovereignty. It was survival wrapped in velvet. The court in exile. In exile was a ghost of its former self, a handful of nobles, a priest or two, old guards in faded uniforms. They held ceremonies, issued proclamations, celebrated feast days, all while the rest of Europe forgot they existed. Francis signed decrees no one read. He awarded titles that meant nothing. He prayed for a restoration no one planned. He began to write manifestos, long, elaborate declarations calling for the return of his crown, the undoing of unification, the triumph of rightful monarchy. He sent them to Austria, to France, to Bavaria, even to Russia. Most were never answered. A few were returned unopened. Some were politely acknowledged, then discarded. He had no army, no allies, no throne, only his name. And even that began to fade. Maria Sophie, after a time, could no longer bear the stillness. She returned to Bavaria, to family, to salons where she was still admired, still adored, still sharp. She lived apart from Francis. Not in hostility, but in quiet separation. Their letters became less frequent. Their meetings, rare. Their marriage, once cold and constrained, settled into silence. And the people of Italy? They celebrated. They declared a new era. They built statues to Garibaldi. They minted coins with the face of Victor Emmanuel. They sang songs of liberty, painted banners of green, white, red, and buried the memory of the old kingdom beneath layers of progress. The palace in Naples was renovated. New flags were sewn. The old chapel was emptied. A room once reserved for royal baptisms became a museum exhibit. Tourists would one day walk its halls, reading plaques that said "Former King" and "Former Queen," as if those titles were costumes left in a wardrobe too long. No one visited Francis. No one called him Majesty. No one remembered the child who had prayed too often. The man who had ruled for barely 2 years, the king who had lost his city not to fire, but to forgetting. And so he remained in exile, not just from land, but from time. He was still called king, but only by those who had no countries left to speak from. After Gaeta, after Naples, after the bells stopped ringing and the banners stopped waving, Francis II entered the long winter of his life. A winter without seasons, without change, without sound. He was 25 years old when he lost his crown. He would live 33 more years in exile. And for every one of those days, he remained a king only in memory, in the eyes of God, perhaps, but not in the pages of history. The world moved on. Italy was born, flags changed, streets were renamed, the Bourbon crest was carved off government buildings. But Francis did not change. He clung to the same rituals, the same prayers, the same routines. Each morning he rose early. He crossed himself 3 times. He dressed in black. He read scripture. He walked silently through borrowed gardens, and he waited. Not for restoration, not even for death, but for the world to remember what it had cast aside. No one did. He settled first in Rome under the protection of the Pope. The Papal States, themselves under threat from unification, offered a temporary haven. There, among exiled aristocrats and aging cardinals, he was treated with respect, but never power. His court, if it could still be called that, shrank to a handful of loyal nobles, priests, and elderly military men with medals for wars they had lost. They held ceremonies. They kept up appearances. They issued declarations in his name, condemning the theft of his throne, the rebellion of his people, the apostasy of the modern age. But the world did not listen. Ambassadors did not come. Crowds did not gather. Foreign monarchs, even those who sympathized, treated him with pity, not solidarity. Austria offered him comfort, not action. Bavaria offered polite correspondence, not intervention. France ignored him entirely, and when he wrote to the Vatican asking for diplomatic support, even the Pope advised patience, not plans. No one wanted to provoke the new kingdom of Italy. No one wanted to gamble their future on a king whose own people had not fought to keep him. He became a ghost, a man who signed documents no one read, a sovereign whose realm existed only on letterhead and in fading memories. Maria Sophie had left for Bavaria. Officially, she remained his queen. Unofficially, she lived another life, one filled with salons, charity, social affairs, and long silences. Their marriage, never warm, turned cold and then still. They exchanged letters, brief and respectful. She visited occasionally, always as a guest, never as a wife. The child they had lost, their only child, became the last thread that connected them. And as time passed, even that thread thinned. In Austria, Francis found quieter exile. He lived in small residences, country estates, borrowed apartments on the outskirts of forgotten cities. He rarely traveled. He avoided crowds. His health, already fragile, began to fail. He suffered from headaches, tremors, and exhaustion that no doctor could cure. They called it nervous collapse. Some said it was melancholia. Others blamed it on his childhood, his lineage, his isolation. He rarely spoke of politics anymore. The manifestos stopped. The declarations ended. He no longer wrote to foreign courts. He no longer asked for restoration. Instead, he turned inward. He collected relics. He read books on saints. He spent hours each day in silent prayer. His meals were modest, his clothing plain. He wore the same coat until it frayed at the sleeves. He gave away his jewelry. He refused parties. When visitors came, and they rarely did, he greeted them politely, then disappeared into another room. He lived like a monk, but without the peace of one. In Arco, a small town in the Austrian Tyrol, he found his final home, a modest villa surrounded by mountains, fog, and quiet. There were no guards, no banners, only a handful of servants and a chapel. He spent his mornings walking slowly along shaded paths, his steps uncertain, his breath shallow. In the afternoons, he sat by the window, reading scripture aloud in Latin, though no one was there to listen. Locals knew who he was, but they didn't speak of it. Children were told he had once been a king. Most didn't believe it. He looked like an old man with too much sadness in his eyes, not like someone who had ever worn a crown. And when illness came, as it always does, he did not fight it. His body, long frail, began to fail completely in the early 1890s. Diabetes took his strength. Circulatory problems darkened his limbs. His eyesight dimmed. His memory blurred. Some days he could not walk. Other days, he simply chose not to. He refused prolonged treatments. He avoided hospitals. He preferred pain to intrusion. He said little of death. But when his confessor asked if he was ready, Francis simply replied, "I have been waiting." On December 27, 1894, Francis II died. There was no national mourning, no public ceremony, no procession. A private mass was held. A few scattered aristocrats attended. There were no royal drums, no salutes, no cries of grief echoing through the streets. He was buried quietly, far from Naples, far from his kingdom, far from the sea he had once ruled and the people who had once called him king. No one wept loudly. No bells rang. His name was added to a genealogy chart. His portrait placed among others no one remembered. A line ended. A chapter closed. Francis II had been the king of the Two Sicilies. He had ruled for barely 2 years. He had lost a daughter, a throne, a people. And in the end, he lost even the memory of those things. History did not erase him with malice. It simply turned the page. He faded. She burned. In the story of the fall of the Two Sicilies, Francis II disappeared into exile like a dying ember, quiet, dim, undemanding, but Maria Sophie did not vanish with him. She refused to. Where he retreated into silence and devotion, she charged into history with her head high, her fists clenched, and a voice sharp enough to cut through decades of erasure. She had once been a teenage bride in a court that whispered behind her back. A queen with no consummated marriage, no power, and no heir. She had walked the halls of Naples alone, surrounded by priests and protocol, longing for movement in a kingdom that feared it. But in the siege of Gaeta, something inside her shifted. Something old broke, and something dangerous took its place. While Francis had knelt in chapel, Maria Sophie had climbed the ramparts. She stood shoulder to shoulder with soldiers. She helped carry food. She visited the wounded. She moved through falling plaster, smoke, and shrapnel with the calm of someone who no longer feared ruin. Letters from the time describe her as a queen-turned-general, a Bavarian lioness, and even the only man at Gaeta. The legend began there, but it did not end there. After the surrender, she followed her husband into exile in Rome, but her body remained present only in form. Her spirit strained against the walls. The papal courts suffocated her. The endless rosaries, the sighing courtiers, the futile declarations, all of it reeked of decay. She had survived siege and humiliation. She had buried her only child. She had watched her throne dissolve, and now she was expected to spend her life in shadow? She would not. By the mid-1860s, Maria Sophie left. Officially, it was for health. Privately, it was escape. She returned to Bavaria, to a land that still remembered her as the sister of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, and the daughter of a proud liberal duchy. She re-entered the world of salons, letters, and politics. There, in the drawing rooms of Munich and Paris, she was admired not just for her beauty, which was still formidable, but for her mind. Fluent in several languages, curious, sharp-tongued, and unafraid of scandal, Maria Sophie carved a new identity from the ashes of her old one. She became, in exile, more powerful than she had ever been as queen. There were rumors. Of course there were. whispers of affairs, of letters exchanged with poets and soldiers, of a child born in secret, a daughter hidden then adopted by others. The story remains contested. Some say she had fallen in love with a noble officer during the siege, and the child was his. Others deny it entirely. History has left it open, like a wound never fully closed. What remains certain is this: Maria Sophie lived, fully, passionately, recklessly at times. She was no longer a consort. She was no longer waiting for permission. In an age where dethroned queens were expected to retreat into convents or silence, she chose defiance. She wrote letters condemning the unification of Italy. She gave interviews, sharp, articulate, dangerous. She mocked the new monarchy. She ridiculed their ceremonies. She refused to acknowledge the Italian tricolor as legitimate. "It waves over a lie," she once said. To royalists across Europe, she became a symbol. To nationalists, a nuisance. To monarchists clinging to fading maps, she was the last queen who had not yet bowed. Her image appeared in loyalist publications. Her words were quoted by underground Bourbon societies. In Naples, long after the monarchy had vanished, people still remembered her with something close to reverence. Not for what she had ruled, but for how she had fought. She and Francis saw each other rarely. Their marriage, always awkward, became distant in every way. They were still husband and wife on paper, but their lives diverged like railroad tracks, parallel but never meeting. When they did write, it was brief. When they did meet, it was formal. They shared a history, but not a future. There were no more children, no more hope, only civility. And yet, she never divorced him. Not publicly, not privately. Whatever had been broken between them, she never shattered entirely. She wore black for him when he died. She preserved his memory, even when she did not share his path. For decades, she remained a living relic of a dead world, but one who refused to speak the language of ghosts. In the late 19th century, as nationalism surged and monarchies crumbled, Maria Sophie became something else entirely: a myth. A widow without widowhood. A queen without a crown. She haunted the fringes of Europe's great parties, a reminder of a time when royalty still meant ritual and resistance still cost blood. In Paris, people pointed her out at soirees and whispered of Gaeta. In Munich, writers toasted her bravery. In Rome, she was still watched. She lived through revolutions, wars, and the births of republics. She watched as her siblings died. Her family tree withered, her lineage collapsed inward like a house eaten from the inside. The Bourbons were vanishing. The Habsburgs cracking. The world was growing louder, more modern, less forgiving. But she remained, tall, composed, eyes still sharp, voice still clear. She outlived Francis by 31 years. When she finally died in 1925, she was 83, no longer young, no longer powerful, but still remembered. They buried her with full honors in Bavaria. Crowds came, eulogies were spoken. No kings attended, but many bowed, not to her title, not to her blood, but to her will, because Maria Sophie was never truly the Queen of Naples. Naples did not want her. History did not hold her gently. But she had been a queen of defiance, of resistance, of endurance. She did not save a throne, but she refused to let it die without witness. Some dynasties end in violence, others in revolution. But some, like the Bourbons of Naples, end quietly by running out of blood. Francis II left no heir, no son to carry his name, no daughter to bear his memory, no child to whisper the old prayers or touch the walls of the palace once called home. His only child, Francesca Maria Pia, had lived just a few months, a tiny heartbeat that flickered and vanished, leaving behind 2 grieving parents and an empty cradle in a forgotten room. Her death was not recorded with trumpets or poems. No great mourning swept the court. There was no succession crisis, because there was no succession. Just a king and queen staring at a crib they would never need again. After Francesca died, the dynasty unraveled not with drama, but with a slow and sickly fade. Francis had cousins, distant ones, second and third degree relatives scattered across the Catholic monarchies of Europe, princes too old, princesses too cloistered, dukes too irrelevant. Some had titles, few had health. Many were inbred, secluded, or infertile. The Bourbon Two Sicilies line, already weakened by generations of consanguinity, had become a tangle of broken branches, twisted, fragile, closed. The Habsburgs and Bourbons had intermarried so often that their children bore the same blood multiple times over. Genetic diversity, once the unseen protector of dynasties, had been abandoned in favor of alliances drawn in ink and sealed with cousins. What they preserved in tradition, they lost in viability. And Francis, thin-boned, soft-spoken, prone to illness and sorrow, was the last living symbol of that choice. He was not infertile by decree. There was no official diagnosis, no scandalous admission. But the facts spoke for themselves. No more children came, no bastards, no rumors, no hopeful mistresses waiting for legitimacy. His marriage to Maria Sophie, already cold, yielded nothing more after the death of their daughter. And so the line, royal and divine, simply stopped. There were whispers that he had considered adopting, that he might legitimize a distant nephew or name an heir by political will. But none of these plans came to pass. He was too passive, too religious, too resigned. To Francis, it seemed that if God had closed the line, it was not for him to reopen it. And in exile, he watched as his world thinned. Each year, the letters came. News of a cousin gone mad in a convent. Another dead from a fever in Vienna. Another swallowed by morphine and melancholy in Madrid. The names grew shorter, the titles less respected, the houses dimmer. The bloodline faded. Not from violence, but from weakness, from too much prayer and too little passion, from marriages that had confused preservation with paralysis. One by one, the candles of the family guttered out. The Bourbon Two Sicilies line had once stretched across kingdoms: Naples, Sicily, Spain, Parma, Madrid, Vienna. At its height, it was a spiderweb of power spun across Europe. But by the late 1800s, it had become a whisper in the margins of ceremonial bulletins, a name mentioned after more important affairs, a line on a family tree that no longer mattered. The new Italy did not look back. The Republicans scorned royalists. The nationalists mocked the old families. The newspapers ignored Francis unless there was a funeral to report or a minor scandal to invent. No one wondered what happened to the king who had lost everything. No one asked who would inherit a crown that no longer existed. In the end, even the church, once the strongest defender of Francis's legitimacy, grew silent. Pope Pius X, who had sheltered him after Gaeta, died. His successor, Leo XIII, leaned toward diplomacy with the new order. The Papal States were lost. The Vatican itself was shrinking. There was no more room for dead kings and their forgotten legacies. Francis wrote fewer letters, spoke to fewer visitors, held fewer hopes. In his villa in Arco, he kept portraits of his ancestors on the walls. Heavy, oil-painted faces, looking down with judgment, sorrow, and pride. But they were ghosts, stiff in frame, silent in eternity. He would not be followed by another. He would be the last. There is a pain in knowing your name ends with you. There is a silence in being the final punctuation in a sentence written across centuries. And Francis bore that silence daily. He left no memoirs, no grand speeches, no volumes of thought or philosophy. He left only prayers, brief notes to confessors, and a handful of proclamations signed Franciscus Dei Gratia Rex Utriusque Siciliae. Francis, by the grace of God, King of the Two Sicilies, long after the grace was gone and the kingdom was dust. Even in death, he passed his title not to a son, but to a cousin who inherited it in name alone. Alfonso, Count of Caserta, would call himself head of the royal house, but the world did not care. Italy had no room for kings without crowns. The bloodline, already diluted, continued only in ceremony. The Bourbon Two Sicilies name became a decorative relic, a title used at weddings, funerals, and on rare occasions when tradition required a shadow to dance behind the new sun. Francis had been born into a family that wanted eternity. He died knowing they had achieved extinction instead. Not by fire, not by sword, not by rebellion, but by folding inward, by marrying too close, by trusting that blood alone could last forever. And when the candles were blown out, there was no one left to relight them. He died quietly, as he had lived, as he had ruled, as he had been forgotten. On December 27, 1894, in the Alpine town of Arco, no longer in his kingdom, no longer in the world's memory, Francis II, last king of the Two Sicilies, took his final breath in a villa that did not belong to him. He was 58 years old. His body had been deteriorating for years. Diabetes had ravaged his nerves. Circulatory collapse left his legs cold and stiff. He could barely hold a pen. He had long stopped signing anything. In his final weeks, his appetite vanished. His vision blurred. His speech came in fragments. Visitors reported he often confused the names of long-dead ministers with those of saints. When the priest administered last rites, Francis whispered only one word clearly: Napoli. And then he said nothing again. No bells rang. No salvos were fired. No black flags were raised. No cities paused. His death was noted in Catholic royalist newspapers. A paragraph here, a headline there. Former monarch passes away in exile. Francis II, once king, dies in silence. In Rome, the Vatican offered a short blessing. In Vienna, a mass was held. In Naples, no public announcement was made. No mourning was declared. The Italian government issued no statement. It had nothing to say about a man it had long buried in absence. His body was washed by hand. No royal servants remained. Only a few faithful attendants, men who had followed him since Gaeta, their uniforms faded to gray, their medals dulled by decades of defeat. The villa was hushed, the curtains drawn. The only sound came from the ticking of a clock on a nearby mantel, counting down the final minutes of a dynasty that had already ended. Maria Sophie was not present. She was in Munich, distant in geography and in life. Though still his wife by law, she had lived separately for decades. When she received the news, she wept, not loudly, not publicly, but with the worn restraint of a woman who had lost much long ago. She wore mourning black, out of duty. She sent a letter, out of memory. But she did not come to the funeral. There was no crown placed on his coffin. no throne left vacant in his name, no heir to walk behind the procession, no child to receive the folded banner of his reign. His coffin was plain, wooden, modest, no gold, no velvet. A silver crucifix lay atop the lid. Inside, his hands were folded around a rosary. His wedding ring remained on his finger. His face, pale and drawn, had not known joy in many years. The illness had hollowed him out. But even in death, he looked composed, not regal, but at peace. A small procession followed the cart that carried him. 2 priests, a handful of former officers, a distant cousin, a few loyal Neapolitan exiles who had grown old, remembering a country that no longer existed. They walked slowly, without drums, without hymns. No crowds lined the roads. The locals, though respectful, did not stop to watch. He had never ruled here. He had never been theirs. They buried him in the Franciscan monastery in Arco. A simple mass was held. Latin murmurs echoed off stone walls. The final prayer was short. There was no eulogy, no public recollection of his reign, no monument unveiled. Only a name carved in stone: Franciscus II, Rex II Francis, the last king. In Naples, his death passed like a cloud. The city had moved on. Trams ran, students studied, shops opened. The tricolor flag still waved above government buildings. The new Italy, though still fragile in its own way, did not pause for a man who had once reigned and then vanished. The old royal palace, now a museum, housed portraits of past monarchs. Francis's portrait remained, but no flowers were laid beneath it. No candle was lit. His absence was complete. He had not returned. Not in life, not in ceremony, not even in story. For decades, he had existed in the footnotes of newspapers and in the quiet sighs of monarchist societies scattered across Europe. To the world, he was not tragic enough to mourn, not cruel enough to hate, not wise enough to study. He had been a king without fire, a ruler without war, a man whose greatest flaw was being born into a line that had already reached its conclusion. Even in death, there was no controversy, only stillness. A few years later, his remains were moved to Rome, interred in the Church of Santa Chiara, the royal burial site of his ancestors. There, he rests among kings and queens whose names had once shaped the Mediterranean. But his tomb draws fewer visitors. Tour guides mention him last. His epitaph does not speak of his reign. Only his name, his title, his dates. There is no symbol beside it, no statue above it, no voice to tell his story. He is surrounded by silence, and that silence is final. A kingdom fell. A name disappeared, a king died, and the world barely noticed. That was the price of forgetting. That was the legacy of bloodlines that folded too far. That was the end of Francis II. He was not a tyrant. He was not a monster. He did not slaughter or torture or burn. He simply faded, like a candle lit in the wrong century. Francis II did not lose his crown because he was cruel. He lost it because he was quiet, because he was cautious, because his hands had been tied long before he was born, tied by lineage, by ritual, by blood that had looped so many times within itself that it no longer knew how to stretch outward. He was the child of cousins. He married his cousin. His only child died in infancy. His line ended with a whisper. And when the kingdom collapsed, no one cried, because the collapse was not sudden. It had been happening for generations. Francis was only the final echo. This is the cost of blood purity. Not just disease, not just fragility, but isolation. Isolation from change, from adaptation, from the messy, vital chaos of life. The Bourbons and Habsburgs believed they could preserve power by containing it. What they preserved was decay. And Francis, devout, obedient, born into a world already vanishing, was never taught to resist it. He wasn't raised to rule. He was raised to endure, to kneel, to wait, to protect the past at all costs, even as the future broke down the gates. What strikes me most is how gentle his failure was, how human. There was no dramatic downfall, no courtroom execution, no palace siege with bayonets at the door, just a slow, painful watching. Watching a city cheer another man, watching a name slip from the tongue, watching a wife walk away, a child die, a crown melt into nothing. And I wonder, what did it feel like to be the last of your kind? To carry not just a name, but the weight of every ancestor who insisted that blood was destiny? To realize too late that it wasn't? He prayed. He hoped. He disappeared. History rarely remembers the quiet ones. But silence has texture. And his silence, long, gray, unbroken, speaks louder than many wars. I think of him sometimes. Not as a king, but as a man. A man raised in a palace that became a prison. A man married to duty and abandoned by history. A man born into too much expectation and too little freedom. And I wonder, if you strip away the crown, the palace, the robes, what is left of a king who was never allowed to be human? Was he a failure? Or was he just a son who tried to be worthy of a father who never looked back? And if we do not mourn such men, who will? What, in the end, is more tragic? A king who died forgotten, or the system that made him forgettable? And how many more must die in silence before we stop mistaking lineage for legacy?